The shelter lights went out at 10, but sleep never came easy on a cot surrounded by strangers. Sarah Mitchell lay still, her right hand trembling against the thin blanket, fingers twitching in rhythms she could no longer control. The involuntary movements had started small, barely noticeable, dismissed as stress or fatigue. Now, 18 months later, they defined her existence in ways that made employment impossible and hope feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. Her daughter, Emily, slept beside her, curled into the smallest possible shape a 7-year-old body could manage. The child had learned not to ask questions about why they lived here, why they had lost the apartment, why Mommy's hands shook when she tried to pour cereal or button Emily's coat. Children adapted faster than adults to the collapse of normalcy. Sarah wasn't sure if that resilience was a blessing or a curse. The diagnosis had come 14 months ago, delivered in a hospital corridor by a neurologist who spoke with clinical precision about genetic inheritance and inevitable progression. Huntington's disease, the same condition that had consumed her mother in slow, cruel increments. Sarah had watched that deterioration throughout her childhood, seen the loss of motor control, the cognitive decline, the personality changes that transformed a vibrant woman into someone unrecognizable. She had sworn she would get tested, know her status, prepare. But life intervened. College debt, single parenthood, survival. The test remained undone until symptoms made it unnecessary. The neurologist explained that Huntington's was merciless in its progression. Movement disorders would worsen. Cognitive function would decline. Eventually, she would require full-time care. The timeline varied, but the destination was fixed. He recommended genetic counseling, support groups, advanced directives. He did not mention how a single mother without insurance or family support was supposed to navigate any of it. The job losses followed predictably. Her hands betrayed her during the simplest tasks. Coffee spilled. Keyboards became obstacles. Customers noticed, then complained, then stopped coming. Employers expressed sympathy while processing termination paperwork. Disability applications drowned in bureaucratic delays, each rejection letter citing insufficient documentation or appeals processes that required resources she didn't have. The apartment went next, then the car, then everything that couldn't fit into 2 duffel bags and Emily's backpack. The shelter became their address, temporary at first, then indefinite. The staff were kind but stretched impossibly thin, managing crises that made Sarah's situation appear manageable by comparison. She tried to maintain routines for Emily. School attendance, homework, bedtime stories whispered in corners that smelled of industrial cleaner and unwashed bodies. The child never complained, which somehow made it worse. Morning arrived with harsh fluorescent light and a shuffle of people preparing for another day of searching. Sarah sat up slowly, waited for the dizziness to pass, then guided Emily through the morning routine with hands that refused to cooperate fully. Breakfast was institutional oatmeal and donated fruit. Emily ate mechanically, her eyes distant in the way children's eyes became when they stopped believing in better possibilities. The news came during the afternoon rest period, delivered by a shelter administrator named Patricia, who had always treated Sarah with particular gentleness. There was a call, Patricia explained, from an attorney's office. An estate matter requiring Sarah's attention. The words felt disconnected from reality, as if Patricia were speaking about someone else entirely. Sarah didn't know any attorneys. She had no estate, no property, no assets worth legal consideration. Her immediate assumption was scam or mistake, but Patricia handed her a phone number written on official letterhead and encouraged her to call. The law firm's name meant nothing to her, but the address was local, legitimate. The call connected to a receptionist, then to a paralegal, finally to an attorney named Marcus Chun, who spoke with careful formality. He asked for her full name, date of birth, mother's maiden name. Security questions that felt invasive given her circumstances. Then he asked if she was aware that her uncle, Dr. Gerald Mitchell, had passed away 6 weeks earlier. Sarah's breath caught. Uncle Gerald, her mother's brother, the one who had vanished into his research decades ago, who sent cards on birthdays but never visited, who existed more as concept than presence. She had known vaguely that he worked in neuroscience, that he ran some kind of private research facility, but he had chosen science over family with the single-minded focus of men who believed their work mattered more than relationships. She hadn't known he was dead. No one had told her. Mr. Chun explained that Dr. Mitchell had died without children, without a spouse, without close relationships beyond his professional network. His will, updated 3 months before his death, designated Sarah as his sole heir. There were assets, Mr. Chun continued, that required immediate attention. Would she be able to come to the office? Sarah looked around the shelter, at the rows of cots, and the people who lived suspended between one crisis and the next. She had $12 in her pocket and no transportation. She explained this to Mr. Chun with the blunt honesty that came from having nothing left to protect. He paused, then offered to send a car. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Emily sensed her agitation and curled closer, small hand finding Sarah's trembling one. Sarah thought about Uncle Gerald, about the man she barely remembered. Family legend painted him as brilliant but cold, devoted to understanding the human brain while remaining disconnected from actual humans. Her mother had spoken of him rarely, and when she did, it was with a mix of pride and resentment. Pride in his achievements, resentment at his absence during her illness. The car arrived exactly at 10, a simple sedan driven by a professional service. Patricia watched Sarah and Emily climb in with an expression of cautious hope. The shelter saw plenty of disappointments. Rare good news was treated with skepticism until proven real. The law office occupied the 8th floor of a building downtown. The receptionist greeted them warmly, offered water and cookies to Emily, and guided Sarah to a conference room where Mr. Chun waited with files stacked neatly on polished wood. He was younger than his voice suggested, perhaps 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering news that changed lives. He began with condolences, though Sarah struggled to feel grief for a man she hardly knew. Then he opened the first folder. Dr. Gerald Mitchell had owned a private neuroscience research facility on the outskirts of the city. The building had been his life's work, constructed gradually over 3 decades, funded by research grants, pharmaceutical partnerships, and his own salary. It was not large by institutional standards, but it was fully equipped, complete with laboratory spaces, a small animal research wing, and extensive data storage systems. The facility had been closed since his death, pending his state resolution. Mr. Chun explained that several pharmaceutical companies had expressed interest in acquiring the property and its assets, but Dr. Mitchell's will contain specific instructions. The facility was to be offered first to Sarah, along with all equipment, research materials, and intellectual property it contained. If she chose not to accept, it would be sold and proceeds donated to Huntington's disease research. Sarah stared at him, struggling to process the information. She owned a neuroscience laboratory. The absurdity was almost laughable. She had no scientific training, no understanding of research protocols, no ability to operate a facility that required expertise she didn't possess. Her hands shook visibly on the table between them. Mr. Chun continued, his tone carefully neutral. There were complications. The facility had been appraised at $850. Not $850,000. $850. The structure itself was old, built piecemeal over decades with minimal attention to cosmetic appeal. The neighborhood had declined significantly. The building required immediate repairs to meet current safety codes. The equipment, while once cutting-edge, was largely obsolete by modern research standards. Multiple pharmaceutical companies had inspected the property and declined to make offers exceeding scrap value. The land beneath it was contaminated from decades of chemical disposal, requiring expensive remediation before any redevelopment could occur. The building was, in essence, worthless except to someone desperate enough to take on its burdens. There were also debts. Dr. Mitchell had died with outstanding equipment loans, unpaid utility bills, and deferred maintenance costs. As heir, Sarah would inherit these obligations along with the property. The total financial burden exceeded $20,000. Mr. Chun laid out the options with clinical precision. She could accept the inheritance, assuming all associated debts and responsibilities. She could decline, allowing the property to be sold for scrap with proceeds going to research charities. Or she could delay the decision, though each week of delay accrued additional costs in utilities and security. Sarah felt Emily's small hand grip her sleeve. The child had been quietly coloring in the corner, but had somehow sensed the weight of the moment. Sarah looked at her daughter's face, saw the question there that children learned not to ask aloud in shelters. Are we going to be okay? She thought about the tremors in her hands, about the progression charts the neurologist had shown her, about the timeline that grew shorter with each passing month. She thought about the shelter cots and the institutional oatmeal and the way Emily had stopped talking about the future. Then she thought about something else. Her uncle had spent his life studying Huntington's disease. Not generically, not as one condition among many, but specifically, obsessively. His research papers, the few Sarah had found online during sleepless nights, focused exclusively on the genetic mechanisms of neurodegeneration. He had been searching for something driven by the same family history that now destroyed Sarah's motor control. She asked Mr. Chen a question that felt both desperate and necessary. Did the facility contain Dr. Mitchell's research data, his notes, his findings, his life's work? Mr. Chen consulted his files. Yes, extensive archives. The pharmaceutical companies had reviewed them briefly, but found nothing commercially viable. The research was thorough but incomplete, theoretical frameworks without practical applications. Decades of work that had never translated into treatments or patents worth pursuing. Sarah made her decision in the space between one tremor and the next. She would accept the inheritance. All of it. The worthless building, the obsolete equipment, the crushing debt. She had nothing to lose that wasn't already slipping through her failing fingers. Mr. Chen's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been concern or possibly respect. He asked if she understood the implications. She did. She was choosing to own a problem, not a solution. But problems, at least, were tangible. They existed. They could be examined. The paperwork took hours. Signatures on documents Sarah barely understood. Legal terms that blurred together, liability waivers and debt acknowledgments and transfer agreements. Emily fell asleep in her chair. Mr. Chun ordered sandwiches. The process ground forward with bureaucratic inevitability. By late afternoon, Sarah Mitchell owned property for the first time in her life. A decaying neuroscience laboratory worth less than a used car, burdened with debts that would take years to resolve, located in a neighborhood where property values measured success by how quickly you could leave. Mr. Chun handed her a key ring with 7 keys, none labeled. He provided an address, security codes that might or might not still function, and contact information for the property management company that had been maintaining minimal security since Dr. Mitchell's death. He also gave her a check for $1,800, the remaining balance in Dr. Mitchell's personal account after funeral expenses and immediate bills. It was more money than Sarah had held in months. It was also barely enough to begin addressing the obligations she had just accepted. She carried Emily to the waiting car, the child still sleeping against her shoulder. The driver returned them to the shelter in silence. Patricia met them at the door, her expression asking the question before her words could. Sarah simply held up the key ring and smiled, a strange, fragile expression that contained more uncertainty than joy. That night, lying on a shelter cot with Emily curled against her, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine the building that was now hers. She pictured her uncle, a man she barely remembered, spending decades in pursuit of answers to the disease that had killed his sister and now consumed his niece. She wondered what he had found in all those years of searching. She wondered if any of it mattered. The tremors in her hand continued their irregular rhythm, marking time in a language only her failing nervous system understood. Tomorrow, she would visit the laboratory. Tomorrow, she would see what $850 had bought her. Tomorrow, she would begin the impossible task of making sense of a legacy built on obsession and isolation. For now, she held her daughter and tried to believe that accepting the burden was somehow different from surrendering to it. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. The shelter settled into its nighttime sounds. And Sarah Mitchell, homeless mother with a fatal diagnosis, became the unlikely owner of a scientific facility no one else wanted. The morning brought rain, cold and persistent, the kind that soaked through inadequate clothing and turned city streets into rivers of runoff. Sarah and Emily stood at the bus stop with the $1,800 check converted into cash, most of it already allocated to debts she had inherited along with the property. The remaining few $100s felt simultaneously substantial and desperately insufficient. The bus route took them through neighborhoods that marked the city's economic decline in precise increments. Well-maintained buildings gave way to graffitied walls, then boarded windows, then structures that seemed to stand only through force of habit. The laboratory's address corresponded to an industrial area that had once housed manufacturing, now reduced to chain-link fences and cracked parking lots. The building appeared exactly as worthless as its $850 valuation suggested. 3 stories of poured concrete and narrow windows, its facade stained with decades of weather and neglect. The loading dock sagged under its own weight. Several windows on the upper floors were cracked. Weeds had colonized the parking lot, pushing through asphalt with botanical persistence. A faded sign near the entrance read, Mitchell Neurological Research Institute, in letters that had once been blue. Now they were gray, barely distinguishable from the concrete behind them. Sarah stood before it with Emily's hand in hers, feeling the weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. The security code Mr. Chun had provided still worked, the electronic lock clicking open with a sound that echoed through the empty entrance. Inside, the air smelled of disuse and old paper, of chemicals faint but present, of spaces designed for purpose but left abandoned. Emergency lighting flickered on automatically, casting the lobby in dim, uncertain illumination. The interior was exactly what Sarah had expected, and somehow worse. The lobby's floor was scuffed linoleum, its walls painted institutional beige. A reception desk stood empty, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. Behind it, a bulletin board still displayed safety protocols and emergency contact numbers, the paper yellowed and curling. Emily clung close, her small voice echoing strangely in the empty space. "Is this ours?" Sarah nodded, unable to form words that would make the answer sound like good news. They moved deeper into the building, following corridors that branched into laboratories and offices. Each room told the same story. Equipment left in place, but clearly obsolete, computers running. Operating systems a decade out of date, glassware and instruments arranged on benches as if their users had simply stepped away and never returned. In one lab, microscopes stood in a neat row, their lenses covered with protective caps that had kept dust at bay but couldn't prevent the passage of technological time. In another, a centrifuge sat silent, its chamber containing samples that had likely degraded beyond any scientific value. Refrigerators hummed quietly on emergency power, their contents a mystery Sarah wasn't yet ready to investigate. The third floor housed what had clearly been Dr. Mitchell's primary workspace. Unlike the shared laboratories below, this area bore the marks of intense personal occupation. Whiteboards covered 3 walls, filled with equations and diagrams in handwriting that varied from meticulous to frantic. Stacks of journals occupied every horizontal surface. A desk sagged under the weight of notebooks, files, and loose papers arranged in systems only their creator could have understood. Sarah approached the desk slowly, her trembling hands hovering over documents she had no ability to interpret. She recognized a few terms from her own medical records. Huntington gene, CAG repeats, protein aggregation. The rest was incomprehensible, the specialized language of a field she had never studied and now owned the physical embodiment of. Emily wandered to the windows, looking out over the industrial wasteland beyond. "It's ugly," she said with the blunt honesty of children. Sarah couldn't disagree. They spent the rest of the morning exploring, taking inventory of what they had inherited. Sarah made lists on the back of deposit slips, the only paper she had. Laboratory equipment, office furniture, filing cabinets filled with decades of research data, a small library of scientific texts, computer servers that hummed in a climate-controlled room, consuming electricity that added to the debt mounting with each passing day. In the basement, they discovered the animal research wing Dr. Mitchell had maintained. The cages stood empty now, cleaned and stored, but the space retained the institutional smell of facilities designed to house living subjects. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Her uncle had worked with animal models, studying disease progression in creatures that couldn't consent to their suffering. The ethical weight of that research pressed against her like physical presence. By early afternoon, Emily was tired and hungry. Sarah had brought granola bars from the shelter, but they were poor substitute for a real meal. They sat in the empty cafeteria, a room with long tables and vending machines that no longer functioned, and ate in silence. Sarah's phone rang, an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. The voice identified itself as representing the building's utility company. They had been informed of the ownership transfer and wished to discuss the outstanding balance of $3,200 for electricity, water, and gas. Payment arrangements needed to be established immediately or services would be discontinued within 72 hours. Sarah explained her situation with the tired honesty of someone who had already disclosed her poverty to countless bureaucrats. She had some money, not enough, and a building with no income potential. Could they work out a payment plan? The voice softened slightly, but remained firm. They could extend the timeline to 30 days, but without a deposit of $800, disconnection was inevitable. Sarah thanked them and ended the call, her hands shaking worse than usual. $800, nearly half of what remained from Uncle Gerald's account. Money that would keep the lights on for 1 month, while accomplishing nothing toward making the facility functional or valuable. She looked around the empty cafeteria, at the institutional furniture and the vending machines that no one would ever use again. The absurdity of her situation pressed down with suffocating weight. She was a homeless single mother with a fatal neurological disease, trying to maintain a worthless research laboratory she didn't understand in a building that consumed resources faster than she could acquire them. The rational choice was obvious. Walk away. Let the property revert to the estate. Let it be sold for scrap. Let someone else deal with the debts and the decay. Return to the shelter and focus on keeping Emily safe for whatever time remained before Sarah's symptoms progressed beyond the point of independent functioning. But something kept her in that chair, staring at the empty room. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope required believing in positive outcomes, and Sarah's experience had taught her better. It was more like stubbornness, the same quality that had kept her applying for jobs long after her tremors made employment impossible, that had kept her filling out disability paperwork through rejection after rejection. Her uncle had spent 30 years in this building, searching for answers to a disease that had killed his sister and now consumed his niece. 30 years of research that pharmaceutical companies dismissed as worthless. But worthless to whom? To companies seeking profitable treatments? Or worthless in the absolute sense, containing nothing of value? Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She told Emily they needed to look at something. They returned to the 3rd floor, to Uncle Gerald's office. Sarah began opening filing cabinets at random, pulling out folders that contained research notes in handwriting that deteriorated noticeably over the years, tracking the progression of the same disease in the researcher himself. The notes were dense, technical, filled with references Sarah didn't understand. But certain phrases repeated across years of entries. Gene therapy protocols, CRISPR modifications, stem cell interventions. Her uncle hadn't just been studying Huntington's. He had been trying to cure it. Sarah's breath caught. She pulled more files, spreading them across the desk. The research was extensive, methodical, building across decades toward something. Experimental treatments, animal trials, genetic sequences modified and tested. None of it had been published. None of it had been shared with the broader scientific community. Why? She found a folder labeled Personal Correspondence and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were letters, handwritten on the same letterhead as the building's faded sign. letters to pharmaceutical companies proposing partnerships, letters to research institutions offering collaboration. Letter after letter, spanning years, each politely declined. The reasons varied. Too speculative. Insufficient preliminary data. Market too small. Regulatory hurdles too significant. But Sarah noticed a pattern. Every letter from Uncle Gerald mentioned one specific aspect of his research. A gene vault. A comprehensive library of Huntington's variations, collected from patients over decades, preserved and cataloged with obsessive precision. She searched the office until she found another folder, thicker than the others, labeled simply Vault Protocol. Inside were inventory lists, genetic samples, patient data anonymized but meticulously detailed, consent forms, storage procedures, and a location. Basement Level 2, Cryogenic Storage Unit 7. Sarah's hands shook as she read. The building had a second basement level, one she hadn't discovered during the morning's exploration. Her uncle had created a genetic library, a repository of Huntington's disease variations that apparently no institution or company had valued enough to pursue. She looked at Emily, who had fallen asleep in Uncle Gerald's desk chair, exhausted by a morning of exploring empty rooms. Sarah thought about the utility bill, about the $800 that would buy them one more month. She thought about the pharmaceutical companies who had inspected this building and found nothing worth acquiring. Then she thought about what they might have missed. The second basement level required a key that took Sarah 20 minutes to identify among the unmarked set Mr. Chun had provided. The door was industrial steel, marked with warning signs about temperature-controlled environments and restricted access. When Sarah finally got it open, cold air rushed out, carrying with it the chemical smell of cryogenic preservation. The space beyond was smaller than the floor above, perhaps a quarter of the building's footprint. But it was immaculately maintained, powered by independent backup systems that had kept it running even as the rest of the facility deteriorated. Temperature controls glowed in the darkness, displays showing -80 degrees Celsius with perfect stability. Sarah found the light switch, and fluorescent tubes flickered to life, revealing a room that looked nothing like the abandoned laboratories above. This space was organized with scientific precision. 7 large storage units lined the walls, each labeled with numbering systems and biohazard warnings. Between them, filing cabinets stood in neat rows, and a small workstation held a computer that appeared far newer than anything else in the building. She approached Storage Unit 7, the one mentioned in Uncle Gerald's files. Its door was secured with both electronic and manual locks. Sarah tried keys until one turned. The electronic system requested a password. She tried obvious combinations. Her mother's birthday, Uncle Gerald's birthday. Nothing worked. Then on impulse, she tried her own birthday. The lock clicked open. Inside, arrayed in precise rows, were thousands of small vials, each containing genetic material preserved in liquid nitrogen. Each vial was labeled with alphanumeric codes. Each had corresponding documentation in the filing system nearby. Sarah pulled one file at random and began reading. Patient 0847. Female, age 32 at sample collection. CAG repeat count, 47. Age of onset, 28. Motor symptoms severe. Cognitive decline moderate. Sample collected with informed consent. Longitudinal data available through patient death at age 41. She pulled another file. Patient 1203. Male, age 19. CAG repeat count, 52. Juvenile onset. Rapid progression. Sample collected with family consent. File after file told the same story. Her uncle had spent 3 decades collecting genetic samples from Huntington's patients, building a library of disease variations that spanned the full spectrum of the condition. Each sample was linked to detailed medical histories, progression data, treatment responses, and outcomes. Sarah's hands trembled as she calculated the scope. Thousands of samples, decades of data, a comprehensive genetic library that documented Huntington's disease with a thoroughness that should have been scientifically invaluable. So why had the pharmaceutical companies dismissed it? She sat at the workstation and powered on the computer. It requested a login. She tried her birthday again. Access granted. The desktop contained a single folder. For Sarah, inside were video files, dated 3 months before Uncle Gerald's death. Sarah clicked the first one. Her uncle's face appeared on screen, gaunt and showing the unmistakable signs of the disease he had spent his life studying. His movements were jerky, his speech slightly slurred, but his eyes were sharp, focused with the intensity of a man racing against his own deterioration. "Sarah," he began, his voice carrying across months of silence. "If you're watching this, you've accepted the inheritance. You're probably confused and angry. You might think I've left you a burden rather than a gift. Let me explain what you actually own." The video continued for 40 minutes. Uncle Gerald spoke directly to the camera, explaining the gene vault's purpose and its contents. He detailed decades of research, methodical documentation of every genetic variation of Huntington's disease he could collect. He explained how pharmaceutical companies had rejected his offers because genetic libraries, by themselves, weren't profitable. They were foundational research, necessary for developing treatments, but too far from actual products to justify investment. But then his tone changed. He leaned closer to the camera, his tremors momentarily forgotten. "What they didn't know," he said, "is that I didn't stop at collection. I used this data. I ran computational analyses that wouldn't be possible even with modern systems because I had access to genetic variations that exist nowhere else. And I found something." He explained his discovery with the careful precision of a scientist who knew his time was limited. Certain rare genetic variations within the Huntington's patients showed unexpected resistance to disease progression. These weren't cures, but they were clues. Genetic signatures that suggested possible therapeutic targets. Modifications that could potentially slow or halt neurodegeneration if properly understood and replicated. The pharmaceutical companies had looked at his gene vault and seen raw data. They hadn't asked about what he'd done with that data. They hadn't examined his computational work or his theoretical frameworks. They had assessed commercial viability and moved on. Uncle Gerald had kept his findings private, not out of spite, but out of caution. He knew that sharing preliminary results without proper validation would destroy credibility. He needed time to verify, to test, to transform theory into demonstrable science. But Huntington's disease progressed faster than his research. The vault contains approximately $567 million in genetic data, he said, his voice growing weaker. That's the conservative estimate from 3 independent valuation firms who assessed it under confidentiality agreements. They based their figures on the cost to replicate this collection, the time required, the patient access necessary. But more importantly, they valued the computational work I've built on top of it. He paused, his hands shaking visibly. "I'm leaving this to you, Sarah, because you understand what it means to live with this disease. You'll make decisions based on that understanding, not on profit margins. The vault needs to be validated. The research needs completion. But the foundation exists. What you do with it determines whether 30 years of work dies with me or becomes something that matters." The video ended. Sarah sat motionless, staring at the screen. Emily had woken and climbed into her lap, seeking warmth in the cold basement. Sarah held her daughter with arms that trembled from more than disease, try to process what she just learned. She owned genetic data worth more than $500 million, preserved in a building valued at $850, buried in a neighborhood where property values were measured in demolition costs. The pharmaceutical companies had inspected this facility and missed it entirely because they had looked at equipment and real estate instead of information. Sarah's mind raced through implications. The vault needed validation. She had no scientific training, no credentials, no ability to perform the complex work required to verify Uncle Gerald's findings. But she had the data. She had his research notes. She had documentation that proved the collection's legitimacy and scope. What she didn't have was time. The utility company would disconnect services in 30 days without payment. The building's debts would continue accumulating. The cryogenic systems required continuous power to preserve samples that had taken 3 decades to collect. If the electricity failed, millions of dollars in genetic material would degrade into worthlessness within hours. Sarah looked down at Emily, at the child who had never asked to be born into the situation. She thought about the shelter cots and the institutional oatmeal and the tremors that worsened daily. She thought about her uncle, working alone in this building for 30 years, watching his sister die and knowing his own fate was identical. Then she thought about what might be possible if someone actually understood what this vault contained. The rain had stopped when they emerged from the basement, leaving the industrial landscape washed clean but no less desolate. Sarah locked the building carefully, checking each door. Twice, suddenly aware that she was protecting something far more valuable than she had imagined. They took the bus back to the shelter, Sarah's mind working through problems that seemed simultaneously insurmountable and oddly clear. She needed money to keep the power on. She needed scientific expertise to validate the vault's contents. She needed time, credibility, and luck in quantities that seemed impossible for someone in her circumstances. But she also had something pharmaceutical companies rarely encountered: motivation that had nothing to do with profit. She had a disease killing her by degrees and a daughter watching it happen. If her uncle's research contained even the possibility of treatment, that possibility mattered more than any commercial calculation. That night, while Emily slept, Sarah sat in the shelter's common area with a borrowed laptop and began researching. She looked up genetic valuation methods, read about data verification protocols, studied how research institutions assess scientific collections. The language was dense, the concepts foreign, but she pushed through, driven by the same stubbornness that had carried her through months of homelessness. By morning, she had a plan. It was desperate, probably futile, and dependent on finding people who valued science over profit margins. But it was a plan, and plans were how you transformed impossible situations into merely difficult ones. Sarah Mitchell, homeless mother with Huntington's disease, owner of a worthless building containing priceless research, closed the laptop and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope exactly, but possibility. And in her circumstances, possibility was enough. The morning after discovering the gene vault's true value, Sarah woke with a clarity that felt almost foreign. For months, each day had begun with the same suffocating awareness of decline, of problems without solutions, of a future that narrowed with each tremor. Now, lying on the shelter cot with Emily's warmth against her side, she felt something different. Not optimism, but direction. The plan she had formed during the sleepless hours was simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. She needed to find scientists who would understand what Uncle Gerald had built. Not pharmaceutical executives focused on quarterly earnings, but researchers who valued foundational data, who understood that genetic libraries were the infrastructure upon which treatments were eventually constructed. She began with universities. Using the shelter's computer during designated hours, Sarah compiled a list of neuroscience departments, focusing on institutions known for Huntington's research. She drafted an email that took 17 attempts to get right, balancing honesty about her circumstances with credibility about what she possessed. The responses arrived quickly, almost uniformly dismissive. Department heads politely explained that unsolicited research proposals were outside normal channels. Junior faculty suggested she contact technology transfer offices. One professor replied with a single sentence, suggesting she might be the victim of a scam. No one asked to see the data. Sarah had expected resistance, but the casual dismissal still stung. She was a homeless woman with no credentials claiming to possess research worth millions. Of course, they didn't believe her. Why would they? She shifted tactics. Instead of approaching institutions, she searched for individual researchers whose published work aligned with Uncle Gerald's focus. She read abstracts until her eyes burned, looking for scientists studying genetic variations, computational approaches to neurodegeneration, CRISPR applications for repeat expansion disorders. When she found promising candidates, she crafted personalized messages that demonstrated she at least understood the basics of their work. One researcher, Dr. Jennifer Okafor at a mid-sized state university, responded with cautious interest. Her reply was careful, professional, skeptical, but not dismissive. She had reviewed Sarah's description of a vault and found it intriguing, though she noted that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Would Sarah be willing to provide sample documentation? Sarah spent 2 days in the library, scanning pages from Uncle Gerald's files. She selected materials carefully, patient consent forms with identifying information redacted, sample inventory sheets showing the collection scope, computational analyses demonstrating the work's sophistication. She avoided anything that looked too good to be true, focusing instead on documentation that proved legitimacy through mundane detail. Dr. Okafor's second email arrived 4 days later. The tone had shifted. She had consulted with colleagues who specialized in genetic data valuation. If the materials Sarah sent were representative of the full collection, this was potentially significant. Could they arrange a site visit? Sarah felt her hands shake worse than usual as she typed her response. Yes, absolutely. When? The coordination took another week. Dr. Okafor needed to align schedules with 2 colleagues, arrange travel, and secure departmental approval for what was still, officially, an exploratory consultation. Sarah used the time to prepare the facility, which meant confronting the reality of its condition. With the last of Uncle Gerald's money, she paid the utility deposit and 1 month's electricity bill. That left her with $93 in a building that needed thousands in repairs to be presentable. She couldn't afford repairs, so she focused on cleaning. She spent 3 full days scrubbing laboratories, washing windows, organizing files. Emily helped, treating it like a game, creating order from chaos with a 7-year-old's earnest enthusiasm. The neighbors watched their efforts with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity. An elderly man who operated a scrap yard across the street stopped by on the second day, asking if they were moving in. Sarah explained she owned the building, was preparing it for visitors. He nodded slowly, his eyes taking in her trembling hands, her daughter's worn clothes, the shelter's address on the forms visible through the window. A lot of folks try to make something of that place, he said. Your uncle was the last. Good man, kept himself. Whatever you're trying to do, hope it works better for you than it did for him. Sarah thanked him without correcting his assumption. Uncle Gerald's work hadn't failed. It had simply outlasted him. Dr. Okafor arrived on a Thursday morning with 2 colleagues, Dr. Marcus Webb, a geneticist specializing in data analysis, and Dr. Sarah Choi, who had built her career on patient-derived research collections. They were younger than Sarah expected, probably early 40s, dressed in academic casual, and carrying tablets instead of briefcases. Their initial reaction to the building was visible discomfort. Dr. Webb glanced around the lobby with poorly concealed doubt. Dr. Choi's expression suggested she was questioning her decision to make the trip. Only Dr. Okafor maintained professional neutrality, though her eyes registered the gap between what Sarah had described and what stood before them. Sarah didn't try to hide the facility's condition. She acknowledged the building's age, its location, its abandonment. But then she led them to the second basement level, to the climate-controlled room that hummed with quiet efficiency while the floors above deteriorated. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Dr. Webb approached the storage units with the careful movements of someone recognizing professional work. Dr. Choi pulled up sample documentation on her tablet, cross-referencing it with the physical inventory. Dr. Okafor simply stood still, her eyes moving across the organization's system Uncle Gerald had created, reading the story it told. This is real, Dr. Choi said quietly, more to herself than to her colleagues. This is actually real. They spent 4 hours examining the collection. Sarah gave them access to Uncle Gerald's computer system, showed them the computational work he had completed, provided context where she could, and admitted ignorance where she couldn't. Emily sat in the corner with a coloring book, occasionally looking up at the adults who spoke in words she didn't understand. The scientists asked increasingly technical questions. Sarah couldn't answer most of them, but she could show them where Uncle Gerald had documented his answers. The research notes, the patient files, the longitudinal studies that tracked disease progression over years. It was all there, meticulously preserved, waiting for someone with the expertise to understand its full implications. When they finally emerged from the basement, Dr. Okafor's professional reserve had cracked slightly. "This collection," she said carefully, "represents decades of work that should not exist in private hands. The data governance alone would require institutional review boards, ethics committees, legal frameworks. Your uncle operated outside normal channels." Sarah nodded. "He collected samples with patient consent. Every file includes signed authorization. He followed protocols, just not through official institutions. Because no institution would support this kind of longitudinal collection," Dr. Webb added, his tone thoughtful rather than critical. "The funding cycles are too short, the payoff too distant. This only happens when someone dedicates their entire career to a single question." Dr. Choi was already calculating on her tablet. "Conservative estimate. The replacement value of this collection exceeds $400 million. That's just assembly costs, not including the computational work or the unique patient variations. If Dr. Mitchell's analysis of resistance factors is verified, the therapeutic implications could justify the higher valuation." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. They believed her. These scientists, with their credentials and institutional authority, were confirming what Uncle Gerald's video had claimed. But Dr. Okafor's next words tempered the moment. "The question isn't value, Sarah. It's what you want to do with this. You can't maintain this collection independently. The technical requirements alone demand institutional support. And even if you could, you lack the expertise to validate or advance the research." Sarah had anticipated this. "I want the research completed. I want my uncle's work to mean something beyond academic curiosity. I want treatments developed, if they're possible." She paused, feeling Emily's small hand slip into hers. "And I want credit for the patients who contributed their genetic material. They trusted my uncle. They deserve to be part of whatever comes from this." The scientists exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that happens between colleagues who have worked together long enough to shortcut conversation. Dr. Okafor spoke first. "We need time to consult with our institutions. This kind of partnership would require extensive negotiations, data sharing agreements, intellectual property considerations, ethical reviews. It could take months." "I have 30 days, Sarah said quietly. "Maybe less. The building's debts are accumulating. If I can't maintain power to the cryogenic systems, the samples degrade. If I can't pay property taxes, the county seizes everything. The genetic data might be worth millions, but I can't access that value before the bills come due." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a problem that had no easy solution. These scientists understood research timelines, institutional bureaucracy, the grinding slowness of academic decision-making. 30 days was nothing. 30 days wouldn't even cover the preliminary meetings required to begin discussions. Dr. Webb broke the quiet with an unexpected question. "What's the monthly cost to maintain minimal operations? Just the cryogenic systems and security?" Sarah pulled out the notebook where she had been tracking every expense. "Electricity is the biggest cost. About $2,000 a month for the whole building, but I could probably reduce that by shutting down everything except the basement systems. Maybe get it down to $1,200. Property taxes are quarterly. Next payment due in 6 weeks. Security monitoring is $300 monthly, though I've been functioning as my own security." Dr. Choi did quick calculations. "So roughly $2,000 monthly for bare minimum sustainability, plus periodic larger expenses." She looked at her colleagues. The discretionary research fund could cover that for a limited period, enough to prevent immediate crisis while we work through proper channels. Dr. Okafor frowned. "That fund is for preliminary studies, not facility maintenance." "This is preliminary work," Dr. Choi countered. "We're assessing a research collection for potential acquisition. Preserving the collection during assessment seems like appropriate use of resources." Sarah watched the debate with cautious hope. These scientists were problem-solving, treating her crisis as a technical challenge rather than an impossible situation. Dr. Okafor remained skeptical, but was clearly considering the possibility. 3 months, she finally said. "We could potentially justify 3 months of support while pursuing formal partnerships." That gives us time to approach institutions, present the collection properly, build a case for significant investment. She turned to Sarah. But you need to understand what you'd be agreeing to. Any partnership would likely involve transferring ownership or at least control of the collection. You become a stakeholder in research you don't direct. Sarah had thought about this during the sleepless nights. I don't need to direct anything. I need treatments to be developed. I need my uncle's work to fulfill its purpose. If that means giving up ownership to people who actually understand the science, that's acceptable. And financially, Dr. Webb asked gently, you mentioned debts. Housing insecurity. This building doesn't generate income. Even if we stabilize its operation, that doesn't address your immediate needs. The question exposed the gap Sarah had been trying not to examine too closely. The gene vault might be worth millions, but those millions existed as potential value, not liquid assets. She could own priceless research and still live in a shelter. The contradiction was almost absurd. Emily tugged on Sarah's sleeve. I'm hungry, Mama. The simple statement cut through the scientific discussion, bringing everything back to immediate reality. These researchers could talk about partnerships and institutional frameworks, but Sarah still needed to feed her daughter. She still needed to figure out where they would sleep tonight and tomorrow and all the nights that followed until her disease progressed beyond the point of independent functioning. Dr. Okafor saw the calculation on Sarah's face. Let's take this in stages, she said, her tone gentler than before. First stage, we secure funding to maintain the facility for 3 months. Second stage, we present the collection to institutions and build a formal partnership proposal. Third stage, we negotiate terms that include appropriate compensation for you as the collection's owner. How much compensation? Sarah asked, too desperate for pride. Unknown until we have institutional commitment. But genetic collections of this quality typically involve licensing agreements, royalty structures if treatments are developed, and acknowledgement payments for contributing parties. Conservative estimate, you'd be looking at 6 figures initially, potentially much more if the research produces viable therapies. 6 figures. Sarah had been living on donated granola bars and shelter meals. The idea of having enough money to secure housing, medical care, and Emily's future felt surreal. But Dr. Webb added a necessary caution. That's best-case scenario, Sarah. Partnerships fail. Research dead ends. Institutions pull funding. We can't guarantee outcomes, only effort. Sarah nodded. Best case is more than I had yesterday. Yesterday, I owned a building worth $850 in debts I couldn't pay. Today, I own research that might matter. I'll take the uncertainty. The scientists agreed to return to their institutions and begin the process. Dr. Choi promised to arrange funding for immediate facility maintenance through her department's discretionary budget. Dr. Okafor would approach the university's technology transfer office about a formal assessment. Dr. Webb would consult with colleagues who specialized in genetic data partnerships. Before they left, Dr. Okafor pulled Sarah aside. I need to ask something personal. Your uncle mentioned in his notes that you have Huntington's disease. Is that accurate? Sarah's hands trembled as she nodded. And you're pursuing this research at least partly because of your own diagnosis? Yes. Dr. Okafor's expression was unreadable. That complicates things ethically. You're not just a collection owner. You're a potential research subject. That creates conflicts of interest that institutional review boards will scrutinize carefully. Sarah felt familiar frustration rising. So, my disease disqualifies me from trying to advance research that might treat my disease. Not disqualifies. Complicates. We'll need to structure agreements carefully to avoid even the appearance of coercion or self-dealing. But it's manageable if we're transparent. Dr. Okafor paused. I'm telling you this now, so you're not surprised later when committees start asking uncomfortable questions about motivation and consent. After the scientists left, Sarah and Emily remained in the building. The afternoon light slanted through the dirty windows, illuminating dust that floated in air that smelled of old chemicals and new possibility. Sarah sat on the floor of the lobby with her daughter in her lap, feeling tremors that would never stop and holding research that might someday prevent others from experiencing them. Emily had fallen asleep again, exhausted by another day in spaces not designed for children. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair with shaking hands and allowed herself a moment of something that resembled hope. The gene vault was real. Scientists with credibility had verified its value. Support was coming, tentative and conditional, but real. The impossible situation was becoming merely improbable, which felt like progress. That night, back at the shelter, Sarah lay awake planning. She needed to document everything Uncle Gerald had created, organize it in ways that made institutional review possible. She needed to learn enough scientific language to communicate intelligently with the researchers who would eventually partner with her. She needed to keep Emily safe and cared for while navigating complexities she barely understood. Most of all, she needed to stay functional long enough to see this through. The Huntington's disease progressing through her nervous system didn't care about gene vaults or research partnerships. It would continue its patient destruction regardless of what she accomplished. The timeline was cruel in its precision, but now, at least, she had resources to fight with. Not money yet, but something potentially more valuable: scientific interest. People who understood what Uncle Gerald had built were beginning to pay attention. The first payment from Dr. Choi's discretionary fund arrived within a week, enough to cover 2 months of electricity and security monitoring. Sarah paid the bills immediately, then spent an entire day in the basement verifying that the cryogenic systems remained stable. Every sample preserved was a small victory against entropy. She began teaching herself neuroscience through online courses and library books, absorbing terminology that would help her communicate with the scientists who would evaluate Uncle Gerald's work. The learning was difficult, her declining cognitive function making retention harder than it should have been, but she persisted. Understanding even fragments of the science made her feel less like a passive beneficiary and more like a legitimate stakeholder. Emily started asking questions about what they were doing. Sarah tried to explain in 7-year-old terms. Grandma had been sick with a disease that made her body move wrong. Uncle Gerald, who Emily had never met, had spent his life trying to understand that disease. Now, they were helping make sure his work wasn't wasted. "Will it make you better?" Emily asked with the directness children wielded like a weapon. Sarah couldn't lie to her daughter. "No, sweetheart, but it might help other people not get sick in the first place." Emily considered this with a seriousness that broke Sarah's heart. "That's good then. Other kids shouldn't have sick mommies." The institutional review process began in the 2nd month. Dr. Okafor's university agreed to conduct a preliminary assessment, sending a team that included not just scientists but ethicists, legal experts, and data governance specialists. They descended on the building like an occupying force, polite but invasive, examining every aspect of Uncle Gerald's collection. Sarah found herself answering the same questions repeatedly. How had consent been obtained? What safeguards existed for patient privacy? Had IRB approval been sought? She explained that Uncle Gerald had operated as a private researcher, following ethical principles but outside institutional frameworks. The answer satisfied no one, but the documentation proved he had at least tried to maintain standards. The ethicist, a professor named Dr. Raymond Martinez, spent hours reviewing consent forms. He found them surprisingly robust, given their independent origin. Uncle Gerald had been meticulous about explaining risks, documenting understanding, maintaining anonymity. The work wasn't perfect by modern standards, but it was far from exploitative. "Your uncle was careful," Dr. Martinez concluded. He understood that genetic material is intimate, that patients were entrusting him with data that could be misused. He built protections into the collection process that many institutional studies don't match. The legal expert was less impressed. The data ownership structure was ambiguous, potentially problematic if any patients or their families decided to contest the collection's use. Sarah would need to trace descendants, seek retroactive authorization, potentially remove samples where consent couldn't be re-verified. Sarah listened to the requirements with sinking awareness. Each additional complication added time and cost to a process already straining her limited resources. The 3-month funding Dr. Choi had secured was nearly half spent, and they hadn't even reached the stage of formal partnership negotiations. Dr. Okafor pulled her aside after a particularly contentious meeting about data governance. "This is taking longer than I anticipated," she admitted. "The institutional machinery moves slowly, especially when dealing with assets this valuable. My university is interested, but they're also cautious. They don't want to commit resources only to have the collection challenged legally." Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossibility settling back onto her shoulders. "So what do I do? Wait while committees debate and my funding runs out? We're trying to accelerate the process, but there are limits to how fast institutions can move." Dr. Okafor hesitated, then added, "Have you considered approaching commercial entities? Pharmaceutical companies might move faster if they see therapeutic potential." Sarah remembered the letters Uncle Gerald had sent, the rejections from companies that had assessed the vault and found it unprofitable. They already dismissed this collection once, because they looked at it as real estate and equipment, not as genetic data. If you approach them now with third-party validation and a clear presentation of the vault's contents, the conversation would be different. The suggestion felt like betrayal of Uncle Gerald's vision, but Sarah couldn't afford ideological purity. She needed the research advanced and her immediate crises addressed. If commercial entities could accomplish both faster than academic institutions, maybe that was the pragmatic choice. She spent the next week preparing a presentation that she barely understood, translating Uncle Gerald's technical work in a language that emphasized therapeutic potential and market value. Dr. Webb helped her identify companies actively working in the Huntington's disease space, filtering for those with capital and interest in genetic approaches. The pitch meetings were brutal. Sarah entered conference rooms where executives in expensive suits listened to a trembling, homeless woman explain why genetic data in a crumbling building represented a valuable investment opportunity. Some were polite, others were dismissive. None made commitments. The consistent feedback was that while the data appeared legitimate, the collection's uncertain legal status made it too risky for immediate acquisition. They would need assurances that patients or families wouldn't sue. They would need institutional partnerships that provided academic credibility. They would need someone other than Sarah managing the collection. Every would need was another obstacle, another delay, another month that Sarah didn't have. The third month of Dr. Choi's funding was ending. Sarah had spent weeks in presentations and negotiations that had produced interest but not action. The building's other debts continued accumulating. Property taxes were due. She sat in the laboratory one evening, Emily asleep on a cot Sarah had brought from the shelter, and tried to calculate pathways forward. Every option required more time than she had, or more expertise than she possessed. The gene vault was valuable, everyone agreed on that. But value couldn't be converted to survival fast enough to matter. Her hands shook worse than usual as she reviewed Uncle Gerald's research notes. She had been so focused on institutional partnerships and commercial deals that she had stopped actually reading the science. Now, alone in the quiet building, she began working through his computational analyses with the limited understanding she had gained. Uncle Gerald had identified specific genetic variations that seemed to confer resistance to rapid disease progression. Patients with these variations showed slower symptom onset, milder motor impairment, longer survival. The differences were subtle but consistent across enough samples to suggest real biological significance. He had theorized that these protective variations could be isolated and potentially introduced into patients through gene therapy approaches. The technical challenges were immense, but the theoretical foundation was solid. If his analysis was correct, the vault didn't just document disease, it pointed toward treatment. Sarah found herself thinking about possibility differently. Everyone focused on the vault's monetary value, on licensing agreements and royalty structures. But the real value wasn't financial. It was medical. Somewhere in these preserved samples might be the key to preventing other children from watching their mothers deteriorate. The thought crystallized into clarity. She had been approaching this wrong. She didn't need to sell the vault or partner with institutions that moved at glacial speeds. She needed to make the research public share it with the global scientific community, and let thousands of researchers pursue the leads Uncle Gerald had identified. The financial implications were terrifying. Making the research public meant abandoning the licensing value that could have provided Emily's future security. But it also meant accelerating the science by years, potentially decades. Instead of one institution slowly working through one avenue of investigation, hundreds of researchers could attack the problem simultaneously. Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting a plan that every advisor would call catastrophically foolish. She would publish the Gene Vault's existence, provide access to researchers worldwide, and release Uncle Gerald's computational analyses under open access frameworks. She would transform a private asset worth millions into public infrastructure worth nothing financially, but everything scientifically. Before she could talk herself out of it, she emailed the plan to Dr. Okafor, Dr. Choi, and Dr. Webb. Then she closed the laptop and lay down beside Emily, her trembling hands finally still. The scientists' responses arrived throughout the night, each one some variation of the same message. This would be professional suicide. She would be giving away value she couldn't afford to lose. Institutions and companies would abandon partnership discussions. She would retain ownership of an empty building and worthless research, while others profited from her uncle's work. Sarah read each objection carefully, understanding their validity. They were right about the financial implications, but they were also thinking about money and careers and institutional advancement. She was thinking about the tremors that woke her at night and the daughter who deserved a mother without a death sentence. In the morning, she sent a single response to all three scientists. I understand the risks. I'm proceeding anyway. My uncle spent 30 years on this research. I won't spend another 30 years navigating institutional bureaucracy while people suffer from a disease we might be able to treat. The decision, once made, brought unexpected peace. Sarah began preparing the Gene Vault for public release, documenting everything in ways that made the collection accessible to researchers without institutional resources. She created databases, wrote protocols, compiled metadata. The work consumed her remaining energy, but it felt purposeful in a way nothing had since the diagnosis. Dr. Okafor called, her tone mixing frustration with reluctant respect. You're making a mistake, Sarah, but if you're determined, let us help you do it properly. Public release requires ethical review, data anonymization, and access frameworks that protect patient privacy. You can't just post genetic data online and hope for the best. Sarah accepted the help gratefully. Over the following weeks, the three scientists guided her through the complex process of making private research public. They helped her navigate review boards, structure data sharing agreements, and build platforms that balanced accessibility with security. The story began attracting attention. A homeless single mother with Huntington's disease was releasing a genetic vault worth millions to the public domain. Media outlets called it either inspiring altruism or foolish idealism, depending on their perspective. Sarah declined most interview requests, focusing instead on the technical work of ensuring the release was done properly. Emily watched her mother work with quiet understanding beyond her years. "Are you giving away Uncle Gerald's treasure?" she asked one afternoon. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I'm giving away the money it could have made us, but I'm keeping something more important. I'm making sure his work helps people." "Will it help you?" "Probably not in time, but maybe it helps someone else's mommy." Emily nodded solemnly, accepting the answer with a gravity that made Sarah's chest ache. The official release happened on a Tuesday morning in the third month, coordinated with publication in an open-access scientific journal that Dr. Okafor had convinced to fast-track the peer review. The Gene Vault's existence became public knowledge, along with Uncle Gerald's computational work and the protocols for requesting access. Within hours, research institutions worldwide were registering interest. Within days, 3 separate teams had identified promising therapeutic targets based on Uncle Gerald's data. Within weeks, the vault had become foundational infrastructure for Huntington's disease research globally. Sarah watched the response with exhausted satisfaction. The financial value she had surrendered was being converted into scientific momentum she could never have generated alone. Her uncle's 30 years of work was finally fulfilling its purpose. But the immediate consequences were exactly as the scientist had predicted. The pharmaceutical companies abandoned partnership discussions. The university withdrew its preliminary acquisition offer. Sarah was left with a building that consumed resources and research that belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to no one. The property taxes came due. Sarah couldn't pay them. The county filed notice of pending seizure. She had transformed a valuable asset into public good and gained nothing tangible in return except the knowledge that somewhere in the data she had released might be the key to treatments she would never receive. On the night before the county's deadline, Sarah sat in Uncle Gerald's office and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the decision she had made. She had chosen science over survival, altruism over pragmatism. It might have been noble. It was definitely foolish. And it was about to cost her the last thing she owned. But then Dr. Choi called with news that changed everything once more. "There's interest," she said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "Not from companies or institutions. From donors. People who saw your story and want to support what you're doing. They're forming a foundation to acquire the building and establish it as a permanent research facility dedicated to open-access genetic research." Sarah's hands shook as she listened. The foundation would assume the building's debts, maintain the infrastructure, and provide her with a position as facility director despite her lack of credentials. Not for her scientific expertise, but for her understanding of what the research meant to patients. They wanted her voice in decisions about how the vault was used. The compensation wasn't the millions she could have commanded through private licensing. It was a modest salary, enough to secure housing and medical care and Emily's education. Enough to live with dignity while her disease progressed. Enough to ensure her daughter's future didn't depend on shelters and donated meals. Why would donors do this? Sarah asked, struggling to believe what she was hearing. "Because you did something rare," Dr. Choi replied. "You chose to make the world better, even when it didn't benefit you directly. That kind of decision resonates with people who have resources and want to see them used meaningfully." The foundation formalized over the following month. Sarah signed agreements that transformed her ownership into stewardship. The building she had valued at $850 became a permanent research facility. The gene vault she had made public became the foundation's core asset, available to researchers worldwide under frameworks that protected patient privacy while advancing science. Sarah moved into a small apartment near the facility with Emily, the first stable housing they had known in over a year. The tremors continued. The disease progressed, but the desperation eased. She had time now, not much, but enough to see her decision validated. Researchers using the vault began publishing findings. Therapeutic targets were identified. Clinical trials were planned. Uncle Gerald's 30 years of work was accelerating discoveries that might not help Sarah, but would almost certainly help future patients. On the one-year anniversary of accepting the inheritance, Sarah stood in the facility's lobby with Emily beside her. The space had been renovated, the dingy linoleum replaced with clean flooring, the walls painted in colors that suggested hope rather than institutional neglect. A plaque near the entrance read, "Mitchell Neurological Research Institute, dedicated to open-access research in memory of Dr. Gerald Mitchell and in honor of Sarah Mitchell, whose decision to share rather than sell transformed private research into public good." Emily read the plaque slowly, sounding out the longer words. "That's you, Mama. You're honored." Sarah smiled, her trembling hands resting on her daughter's shoulders. "We're all honored, sweetheart. Everyone who contributed to building this." Through the windows, she could see researchers arriving for the day's work, young scientists who would use Uncle Gerald's data to ask questions he never had time to answer. Some of them would fail. Some would succeed. All of them would build on foundations that had almost been lost to bureaucracy and neglect. Sarah had chosen to give away value she desperately needed, and somehow that decision had returned value she couldn't have imagined. Not wealth exactly, but purpose. Not security, but meaning. The gene vault had been her inheritance. Making it public had been her gift to a future she would never see. The disease would kill her eventually. That timeline hadn't changed, but what she left behind had. Emily would grow up knowing her mother had faced an impossible choice and chosen generosity over survival. That legacy felt more valuable than any amount of money could have been. As they walked into the building together, Sarah thought about the ranger in one of her favorite stories, the one who had discovered something buried and brought it into the light at great personal cost. She understood that impulse now. Some discoveries were too important to keep hidden, regardless of what exposure cost the discoverer. The gene vault was no longer hers. It belonged to science now, to the researchers who would use it, to the patients who might someday benefit from treatments it inspired. Sarah had transformed from owner to steward, from heir to guardian of something larger than individual need. And in making that transformation, she had found something she thought homelessness and disease had taken from her forever, a reason to believe the future could be better than the past. The first year the Mitchell Institute established rhythms Sarah had forgotten were possible. Wake in an apartment with walls that belonged to her, not temporarily, but with a lease she could afford. Make breakfast in a kitchen where every utensil stayed in its designated place. Walk Emily to school along streets that had become familiar rather than threatening. Return to the facility where her name hung on an office door, modest but permanent. The work itself defied easy description. Sarah wasn't a scientist, would never be one despite the courses she continued taking online. But she understood something the researchers often missed, what the data meant to the people who had contributed it. Every sample in the vault represented a person who had lived with Huntington's disease, who had donated genetic material, hoping it might matter. Her role became translation. When research teams proposed new studies using the vault, Sarah reviewed protocols with a single question: would the patients who donated have approved? She rejected projects that treated the samples as mere data points. She championed work that honored the human cost behind every preserved vial. The Foundation's donors had understood this distinction. They weren't funding abstract science. They were funding research grounded in patient experience, guided by someone who knew intimately what the disease took from people. Sarah's lack of credentials became an asset rather than a liability. Dr. Okafor visited quarterly. Her initial skepticism transformed into something resembling partnership. She brought research teams who wanted vault access, helping Sarah evaluate proposals and establish collaborative frameworks. The relationship had evolved beyond mentor and novice into mutual respect between different kinds of expertise. "You made the right choice," Dr. Okafor said during one visit, watching researchers work in the basement facility that now gleamed with proper lighting and updated equipment. Publishing the vault accelerated progress by at least a decade. 3 clinical trials are using data that originated here. That wouldn't have happened through private licensing. Sarah appreciated the validation, but had stopped needing it. The decision's rightness wasn't measured in acceleration metrics or clinical trials. It was measured in Emily's stability, in the researchers' enthusiasm, in the slow but steady transformation of Uncle Gerald's isolated obsession into collaborative infrastructure. The disease progressed exactly as predicted. Sarah's motor control deteriorated in increments that felt both gradual and sudden. Tasks that had been difficult became impossible. Walking required concentration. Writing by hand was abandoned for voice typing. The tremors intensified until stillness felt like a memory rather than an achievable state. Emily adapted with the resilience children possessed when adults gave them no choice. She learned to help her mother with buttons and zippers, to steady cups before they spilled, to recognize when Sarah needed rest before Sarah admitted it. The child was growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Sarah grieved this theft of childhood, while being grateful Emily had a childhood to be stolen from. The shelter had been worse. Homelessness had compressed Emily's world into survival mode, where joy was suspicious and hope felt dangerous. Now, she had friends, school activities, birthday parties. The disease was taking Sarah's function, but Emily's life was expanding. The Foundation arranged for medical support as symptoms worsened. A part-time aide helped with tasks Sarah could no longer manage independently. Occupational therapy provided adaptive equipment. Neurological monitoring tracked progression with clinical precision that Sarah found both comforting and terrifying. Dr. Martinez, the ethicist who had reviewed Uncle Gerald's consent protocols, returned with an unexpected proposal. The Institute should establish a patient advisory board, including people living with Huntington's disease and family members affected by it. Sarah's experience demonstrated the value of patient perspective in research governance. The board formed slowly, recruiting members who brought diverse experiences of the disease. A retired teacher whose husband had died from complications. A graduate student managing early symptoms while finishing a dissertation. A nurse who had cared for Huntington's patients for 3 decades. Together, they created frameworks ensuring research served patients rather than merely studying them. Sarah chaired meetings with hands that shook progressively worse, her voice occasionally slurring in ways that embarrassed her until the board established a norm of patience. No one rushed her. They waited while she gathered words that increasingly scattered before she could speak them. The work mattered in ways that transcended her individual contribution. The board rejected research proposals that prioritized publishable results over patient benefit. They demanded plain-language summaries of all vault-based studies. They insisted researchers present findings to patient communities before academic conferences. These requirements frustrated some scientists who viewed them as unnecessary barriers. But they also attracted researchers who valued the collaboration, who understood that better science emerged from genuine partnership with the communities it claimed to serve. Emily turned 9, then 10. She was old enough now to understand her mother's diagnosis more completely. To ask questions Sarah answered with careful honesty. Would the disease kill her? Yes, eventually. When? Uncertain, but probably within a few years. Could the research at the Institute help? Maybe others, probably not Sarah herself. Emily absorbed this information with a seriousness that broke Sarah's heart. Then she asked a different question. What happens to me when you're gone? Sarah had been preparing for this conversation, working with social workers and lawyers to establish guardianship arrangements. Patricia from a shelter had agreed to take Emily if needed, providing continuity with someone Emily already knew and trusted. The foundation had established a trust ensuring Emily's education would be funded regardless of Sarah's ability to work. But answering the question required acknowledging a future Sarah desperately didn't want Emily to face. You'll be taken care of, she managed. People who love you will make sure you're safe. But not you. No, sweetheart. Not me. But the work we're doing here, the research your great-uncle started, maybe that helps other kids not lose their mothers this way. Emily considered this with the philosophical gravity of children forced to confront mortality too young. That's good then, even if it doesn't help us. The second year brought breakthrough research built directly on Uncle Gerald's computational analyses. A team in Germany identified a genetic modification that slowed disease progression in animal models by 40%. The work was preliminary, years from human trials, but it proved the vault's data had been pointing toward viable therapeutic targets all along. Sarah read the published paper with trembling hands, struggling through technical language that remained mostly incomprehensible. But she understood the acknowledgement section, where the researchers thanked the Mitchell Institute and specifically noted Sarah's decision to make the vault publicly accessible. Your uncle would be proud, Dr. Choi said, visiting to discuss the German team's findings. He spent 30 years collecting this data. You ensured it actually mattered. Sarah wasn't sure Uncle Gerald would have approved of her approach. He had been protective of his research, cautious about sharing before validation was complete. But he had also been racing against his own deterioration, trying to accomplish in one lifetime what required multiple generations of scientific effort. Making the vault public had distributed that effort across hundreds of researchers worldwide. Uncle Gerald's 30 years became the foundation for thousands of researcher years of collective investigation. The acceleration was exponential, impossible for any private entity to match. The media continued occasional interest in Sarah's story, though she granted interviews rarely and only when they focused on the science rather than personal drama. One profile in a scientific journal described her as the unlikely steward who transformed inherited research into collaborative infrastructure. She appreciated that phrasing, steward rather than owner, transformation rather than donation. The building itself underwent gradual renovation as foundation funding allowed. The crumbling facade was repaired. Windows were replaced. The parking lot was resurfaced. Nothing dramatic, but steady improvement that signaled permanence rather than temporary occupation. The basement vault expanded as new samples were added through partnerships with medical centers. Patients diagnosed with Huntington's disease could now contribute genetic material to the institute, continuing Uncle Gerald's work of documenting disease variation. Each new sample came with updated consent protocols the advisory board had developed, ensuring donors understood exactly how their contribution would be used. Sarah reviewed every consent form personally, a ritual that took increasing effort as her cognitive function declined. But it mattered that someone with lived experience of the disease was reading what researchers asked of patients. She caught language that was too technical, assumptions that were too cavalier, promises that were too optimistic. Her edits made consent forms longer and more honest. Some researchers complained, but patient enrollment actually increased when people understood they were contributing to research guided by someone who shared their diagnosis rather than merely studied it. The third year brought the progression Sarah's neurologist had warned about from the beginning. Cognitive decline accelerated beyond what adaptive strategies could compensate for. She began losing words mid-sentence, forgetting meetings she had attended hours earlier, struggling to follow conversations that would have been simple months before. The Foundation Board, in consultation with the advisory panel, made the difficult decision to transition Sarah from director to emeritus advisor. She would retain her title and her voice in institute decisions, but daily operations would shift to an administrator with the organizational capacity Sarah could no longer provide. Sarah accepted the change with relief and grief. Relief that she could stop pretending her declining function wasn't affecting her work. Grief that another piece of independence was being stripped away by a disease that took everything eventually. Emily was 11 now, old enough to be angry about what was happening. She stopped being resilient and started being furious, directing rage at a mother who couldn't defend herself against genetic inheritance. Sarah weathered the anger with understanding, knowing it wasn't really directed at her, but at a situation that gave a child no acceptable targets for justified rage. They fought about homework and bedtime and chores, normal conflicts amplified by abnormal circumstances. Emily screamed that Sarah didn't understand anything. Sarah agreed with trembling hands and slurring speech that made agreement sound like mockery. They both cried afterward, holding each other in a small apartment that felt simultaneously like sanctuary and prison. Patricia visited weekly, maintaining connection and preparing for a transition neither of them wanted to discuss explicitly. She brought meals and helped with tasks Sarah could no longer manage. She took Emily for outings that gave the child space to be angry without hurting her mother. She documented everything carefully, building a case file for guardianship that would eventually be necessary. The research continued accelerating. The German team's findings inspired 3 other groups to pursue related modifications. A pharmaceutical company announced plans to license one approach for development, with royalties designated for the foundation rather than private profit. The vault was generating exactly the kind of outcomes Uncle Gerald had hoped for, just through pathways he never anticipated. Sarah attended a conference where researchers presented vault-based discoveries. She sat in the audience with an A beside her, struggling to follow presentations that moved too quickly through slides dense with data. But during the acknowledgement sections, when researchers thanked the Mitchell Institute and the patients who had contributed samples, she felt Uncle Gerald's presence almost tangibly. He had died believing his work was incomplete, his life's effort unfinished. Sarah had taken that incomplete work and made it impossible to finish because she had distributed it among too many researchers to ever be completed by any single person or team. Uncle Gerald's failure became his legacy, transformed through Sarah's decision to share rather than control. The fourth year, Sarah spent more time receiving care than providing guidance. The aid became full-time. Patricia moved in temporarily to help with Emily. The apartment filled with medical equipment and adaptive devices that marked progression through stages the neurologist had outlined years earlier. Sarah could no longer read consent forms or review research proposals, but she could listen to summaries, ask questions when words came, and nod approval or shake her head in rejection. The advisory board learned to interpret her limited communication, treating her remaining capacity with respect rather than pity. Emily stopped being angry and started being scared. She clung to her mother during good days and avoided her during bad ones, unable to reconcile the person Sarah was becoming with the mother she remembered. Patricia helped navigate this with patient consistency, never forcing connection, but always facilitating it when Emily was ready. One afternoon, Emily asked to visit the institute. Sarah hadn't been there in months, her condition making travel difficult and her presence potentially distressing to staff who remembered her competence. But Emily insisted, so arrangements were made. They toured the facility slowly, Sarah in a wheelchair pushed by the aide, Emily walking beside them with unusual quietness. The basement vault hummed with its familiar efficiency, preserving samples that now numbered in the thousands. Researchers working in the laboratories looked up and smiled, some coming over to greet Sarah with careful warmth. Emily stopped before the plaque that honored both Uncle Gerald and Sarah. She read it again, as she had countless times before, but this time her question was different. Will they add your dates when you die? Like they did for Uncle Gerald? Sarah managed to nod. Yes, they would. The plaque would document her birth and death, bracketing a life that had been ordinary except for the decision she made when inheritance intersected with desperation. And people will know you helped. Emily pressed. Another nod. The plaque would remain, the research would continue, the vault would keep serving its purpose. Sarah's contribution would be remembered not through personal achievement, but through what she had enabled others to accomplish. Emily seemed satisfied with this answer. They left the institute shortly after, Sarah exhausted and Emily quiet in a way that suggested thinking rather than sadness. That evening, as Patricia helped Sarah prepare for bed, Emily appeared in the doorway. I'm glad you gave away the treasure, she said softly. I was angry before because I wanted the money. But you were right. This matters more. Sarah couldn't form words to respond, but Emily understood. The child climbed into bed beside her mother, careful of the medical equipment, and they lay together in the small apartment that had become their world. The fifth year, Sarah entered hospice care. The disease had progressed to where even basic functions required assistance she could no longer request clearly. Emily was 12, living primarily with Patricia now, but visiting daily when she could bear it. The Institute established a bedside connection, allowing Sarah to listen to research presentations remotely. Scientists would present findings to her specifically, knowing she couldn't respond but trusting she could understand. They described breakthroughs built on Uncle Gerald's data, clinical trials moving forward, patients enrolled in studies that might actually help them. Sarah listened with whatever capacity remained, her tremors now constant but somehow less noticeable as her overall movement diminished. The disease was reaching its endpoint, the neurologist explained gently. Weeks perhaps, possibly days. Dr. Okafor visited one final time, sitting beside Sarah's bed and speaking softly about the impact the vault had achieved. 17 separate research teams were actively using the data. 5 clinical trials were recruiting. 2 potential therapies were showing genuine promise. The German team's modification was entering phase 2 trials. None of this would exist without your decision, Dr. Okafor said. You transformed private research into public infrastructure, and now hundreds of scientists are building on that foundation. That's legacy, Sarah. Real, permanent legacy. Sarah's eyes moved toward Emily, sitting in the corner with homework she was pretending to complete. Her daughter was her legacy, but so was this. The research, the institute, the decision to share rather than sell. Both would outlast her. Both would matter in ways she couldn't fully predict. Patricia arrived as Dr. Okafor left, bringing dinner and gentle competence. She had become Emily's guardian officially now. Paperwork completed, while Sarah could still sign documents with trembling hands. Emily would be safe, educated, supported. The trust the foundation established would ensure her future. That night, Sarah's breathing changed in ways the hospice nurse recognized immediately. Patricia kept Emily close, but not too close, letting the child see her mother while protecting her from details that would haunt her. Emily held Sarah's hand, feeling tremors that had defined years of their life together. "Thank you for the treasure, Mama," Emily whispered. "Even though we didn't keep it." Sarah's eyes found her daughter's face one last time. The tremors slowed, then stopped. The disease that had taken everything took its final portion, leaving behind a body that no longer shook because it no longer moved. Emily cried against Patricia's shoulder while nurses did what needed to be done. The institute was notified. The foundation board was contacted. Arrangements were made with the efficiency that always follows expected deaths. The memorial service happened at the institute, researchers and patients filling the renovated lobby where Sarah's name hung on the plaque beside Uncle Gerald's. Emily read a statement Patricia had helped her write, her voice steady as she explained what her mother had taught her. "She showed me that treasure isn't always money," Emily said. "Sometimes treasure is information that helps people. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is give away what everyone says you should keep." Dr. Choi spoke about Sarah's impact on research governance, how patient perspective had transformed the Institute's approach to science. Dr. Okafor described the acceleration of discovery that Sarah's decision had enabled. Dr. Martinez discussed the ethical frameworks she had helped establish, protecting patient interests while advancing research. Patricia said nothing publicly but held Emily throughout, providing the stability Sarah had fought to give her daughter until the disease made fighting impossible. The plaque was updated with Sarah's dates. Her birth 34 years earlier, her death that morning. The years between were summarized in a single sentence. "Who transformed inherited research into public good." Emily stood before it after everyone left, Patricia waiting patiently nearby. The child reached up and touched her mother's name, tracing letters that would remain long after memory faded. "Did we do the right thing, Patricia?" she asked quietly. Patricia knelt beside her. "Your mother did exactly what she believed mattered most. She chose to help people she would never meet over protecting herself. That's what heroes do." She didn't feel like a hero. She was just scared and sick. Most heroes are sweetheart. They do the right thing anyway. Emily nodded, accepting this wisdom with the seriousness she had learned from watching her mother face impossible choices with deteriorating capacity. They left the institute together, returning to the apartment where Emily would finish growing up in the care of someone who had loved Sarah enough to take her daughter. The research continued, accelerating as more teams built on Uncle Gerald's foundation. The German modification entered phase 3 trials with promising results. Another team identified a genetic marker that predicted disease progression with unprecedented accuracy. A third group developed a screening protocol that could identify at-risk individuals before symptoms appeared. Each breakthrough acknowledged the Mitchell Institute, the vault, and Sarah's decision to make it publicly accessible. Her name appeared in acknowledgement sections of papers she would never read, honoring a contribution that had cost her everything and created possibilities she never lived to see. Emily visited the Institute regularly as she grew older, watching research advance and understanding more clearly what her mother had accomplished. She met patients enrolled in clinical trials, people who might actually benefit from treatments built on data Sarah had released. Some were parents with young children, fighting to avoid leaving them the way Sarah had left Emily. At 17, Emily enrolled in a university program studying genetics, choosing to understand the science her mother had stewarded without comprehension. She wasn't brilliant like Uncle Gerald had been, but she was determined, driven by a need to complete something her family had started across 3 generations. She worked summers at the Institute, first in administrative roles, then as a research assistant. Scientists who had known Sarah treated Emily with special gentleness, seeing in her both the daughter left behind and the legacy continuing forward. During Emily's sophomore year, the German team's therapy received conditional FDA approval for a specific subset of Huntington's patients. It wasn't a cure, but was the first treatment proven to slow progression meaningfully. The announcement made national news, celebrating a breakthrough decades in the making. Emily read the coverage with complex emotions. Her mother had died before this treatment existed. Uncle Gerald had died before the research proving it possible was completed. But the foundation they had built, Gerald through obsessive data collection, Sarah through radical sharing, had made this moment possible. She returned to the institute and stood before the memorial plaque, now surrounded by photos of researchers, patients, and milestones achieved through vault-based work. Her mother's face smiled from one photo, taken during the Institute's first year when Sarah still had motor control and cognitive clarity. Emily touched the photo gently, the same way she had touched her mother's name on the plaque years earlier. "You were right, Mama," she whispered. The treasure mattered more than the money. Behind her, researchers worked in laboratories funded by a foundation built on Sarah's choice. Above her, the building that had been worth $850 now housed research worth billions in therapeutic potential. Around her, patients and families found hope in work that existed only because a desperate woman had chosen generosity over survival. The gene vault hummed in its basement sanctuary, preserving samples that continued teaching scientists about disease and resilience. Uncle Gerald's 30 years of collection, Sarah's moment of decision, and Emily's generation of continuation had created something none of them could have achieved alone. In the end, Sarah Mitchell had inherited a worthless building containing priceless research. She had transformed that inheritance into public infrastructure that would outlast her by generations. She had chosen to give away treasure when she desperately needed it herself, trusting that the value of helping others exceeded the value of personal security. That choice had cost her everything and created something extraordinary. A homeless mother with Huntington's disease had changed the trajectory of research into her condition by refusing to treat data as property. Her legacy wasn't wealth or fame, but acceleration of science that might prevent other daughters from losing their mothers the way she had lost hers. Emily left the institute as evenings settled over the neighborhood that had once felt desolate, but now thrived with the traffic research centers attract. The building stood solid and purposeful, its renovated facade suggesting permanence rather than decay. Inside, researchers worked late, pursuing questions built on foundations laid across 3 generations. Outside, a plaque honored the family who had transformed private obsession into collaborative mission. And somewhere in the future, patients not yet born would benefit from treatments developed using data Sarah Mitchell had decided the world needed more than she needed security. The treasure had been given away, and in that giving, it had multiplied beyond anything ownership could have achieved. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.